the most important thing to think about is what is your Amazon strategy and then what is your Google strategy? Because between those two, when they ask consumers where do they start their search, that covers like 85% of where consumers say they start.
Shower curtain, a new purse, a board game. Whatever it is, 30% of potential buyers are now going to Google, the #1 search engine of all internet history, to look for it. And chances are you've shopped on it too. Deliverr recently announced an integration with Google Shopping. It's now open to all sellers, enabling merchants to display free and fast tags on their Google Shopping ads to optimize ad efficiency and drive sales. You can leverage this integration with your own website via Shopify, or if you don't have one, no problem. You can also connect your Google Merchant Center account with Deliverr and then sell and buy on Google. On the Deliverr side, we've seen sellers get started in just a few days. So it's an extremely simple setup process. And if you're interested at all, head over to deliverr.com/Google. Today, I want to invite an expert to the table to spill all of his Google Shopping knowledge. Here, I have Link Walls. He's the VP of Digital Marketing Strategy over at Channeladvisor. He's worked with 7, 8, 9-figure sellers, is an e-commerce thought leader, and watches Facebook and Google's every move like a hawk. He's the one to listen to if you actually want to stay ahead of the curve. And he thinks you're making a mistake if you're not considering Google Shopping. And here's why.
At the end of the day, I think it's really important for sellers and businesses of all size to have a diversified strategy when they think about where do they find buyers. And the reality is there are different pools of buyers, just like there are different pools of buyers on eBay compared to Amazon, compared to Walmart. There are other pools of buyers that their processes, they tend to start on Google, right? And they're more likely to start there. So I think there's sort of two reasons there, right? So the first is just making sure you have a diversified strategy. That way, if one channel changes, something happens, you've got something else to fall back on. And the second is just to be where the shoppers are, right? And the reality is, when you think about sort of what's going on, especially in the world we live in today, where we see upwards of 70% of the traffic we see, and sometimes 75 and even close to 80% of the traffic we see is on a mobile device. And so what mobile has really done is really narrow the entry points for consumers. And so, when consumers are on their phone, they're going to open an app from maybe a Walmart or an Amazon, or they're going to do a search, right? And that search tends to usually be Google. And so what we don't see consumers doing is downloading 50 different apps from 50 different retailers, or going directly to a lot of websites on the mobile phone. So I think when I think about an e-commerce business in 2020, I think as the most important thing to think about is what is your Amazon strategy and then what is your Google strategy? Because between those two, when they ask consumers where do they start their search, that covers like 85% of where consumers say they start.
How often is it, in your opinion, that potential buyers, they'll see products on Facebook, they'll see products advertised all over. How often is it that they will go verify the product and then do their research on Google? Does Google provide an additional blanket of security for shoppers?
I think so. I mean, I think that happens, right? So if you see something, just like you're saying, the scenario you're saying, you see a product on Facebook, you think maybe it looks good. Let me go see if this company is real, right? I think it absolutely provides a level of sort of validation in the consumer's mind, right? That just says, and that works in reverse too, right? If maybe I see something on Google, but then, maybe I see, oh, well, was this also sold anywhere else, right? Or, so I do think it provides that level of validation for a consumer that says, oh, well, yeah, they have a website. Maybe I'm buying it through Facebook or through Instagram, but, oh yeah, they have a website. It's a real company. It's not some kind of scam.
Google recently came out with news that they're now commission free. So they're making it free to sell your products directly on Google. They will no longer charge you commission fees for purchases made through shopping actions. So they're effectively lowering the barrier to entry. So, if you want to just look into your crystal ball for a bit, like what kind of sellers are going to start hopping in on this trend?
Yeah, so I think it's important maybe to just take a step back and talk about sort of what Google Shopping Actions is and how that's evolved. So, I think most people are familiar with product listing ads, Google Shopping. The traditional flow being I do a search on Google, I see some products, I go off to a website, I buy those products. really what Shopping Actions is a platform that Google rolled out, really going on probably 2-3 years ago now. That's really designed to capture the payment information and the whole flow, right? And so what Google's trying to do is really create an experience that takes friction out of the buying process. So instead of me doing a search and going off to another website and having to put my credit card in and everything else, that is really this just buy on Google, right? And so the way, if you see the phrase buy on Google, Shopping Actions is what's powering that, right? So buy on Google is really the consumer facing language. Shopping Actions is really the back end that's making that happen. So as you mentioned, Google announced just recently that they're going to be moving towards a commission-free model. And so I do think, yes, to your point, I think there will be more sellers that will move you there. I think what I really see if I look out ahead, it's really important to be in both flavors of Google, right? So, not all of the traffic on Google is going to funnel through Google Shopping Actions. And in fact, it may be a small minority of that traffic goes through buy on Google. And a lot of that will really be consumer driven. So if consumers choose and say, hey, it's easier for me to buy on Google, that's a preferred experience, then I think you'll start to see that become the predominant flow. But if consumers say, hey, I'm happy to click on this link and go to this website and buy there, then Google's going to continue to serve ads, of course.
Currently, right now, if someone wants to buy something on Google through, I guess, Google Shopping Actions, but the consumer facing side, what is that process going to look like for them?
Yeah, so that process, I mean, you can see that today if you do it, if you do a search and if you go to the shopping tab, and you select the buy on Google, essentially what Google's built is, a very streamlined experience, right? So I see the product, I see a description, I see the image, depending on, if I've got my payment information in Google, potentially it's as easy as really one click, right? And so very much like an Amazon-like experience of let me just click on this and now I'm done, right? And so that's the experience, and that's really what, and I think the same is true for something like Instagram checkout, where they're trying to make a very streamlined, sometimes I refer to this as really a one-handed commerce experience where, I could be, on a train, holding onto the train, and I could still buy stuff with just, one hand, right? Because I'm simply tapping and I'm not having to put in my credit card. I'm not having to put in my address because those things are already handled, right? So again, it's really the Google in this case, trying to take that friction out of the process.
And on the deliver end, I'm sure we're seeing the opportunity here as well. So we just announced our integration with Google Shopping, which enables online merchants to advertise free and fast tags on their Google Shopping ads to optimize efficiency, ad efficiency, and drive sales. So these tags are going to dynamically display like free 2-day, free 1-day delivery promises across Google Shopping surfaces. And that's based on real-time inventory positions in a delivered network. So how much do you think free and fast shipping badges on Google product listing ads are going to move the needle?
Yeah, it's that's a good question. I mean, so Google's already put out some stats of where they saw, I think it was a 9% lift in conversion rate on using free and fast tags. I think we'll have to see. I think in many respects, that's the expectation from consumers, right? I think one of the things, pandemic notwithstanding, that consumers have really been trained on, specifically by Amazon, is that shipping should be free and it should be fast and it should be 1 or 2 days. And those are expectations that are hard for merchants to live up to and expensive for merchants to live up to, of course. But that's really what the consumer expects. And so I think it's a smart move by Google to add these because, again, if I'm shopping, I think getting that reassurance that this is going to be fast and free, it should only help, right? In the same way that the Prime badge makes a very significant difference, as everybody knows, on Amazon.
Right. And this, like you mentioned, this is exactly what consumers want. So I see a bunch of listings, like just right now scrolling through Google. When I look at the product listing ads, I see like, free 2-day, free 1-day. But when I scroll on buy on Google, I don't necessarily see that being called out. Do you think this is something that they're going to implement in the future sometime soon?
Yeah, I would think they would, right? For the exact same reasons I said before. I mean, it's, again, that's we all know that shipping time and shipping costs is an important element. I mean, just any e-commerce consumer survey you've seen in the last 5 years, when they ask, what's important about, buying stuff online, speed and cost of shipping is always in the top list, right? So yeah, I don't know specifically, when Google would do that, but it certainly would make sense for them to call those things out in the same way they do on the regular Google Shopping ads.
Totally. So we're seeing, like you said, this opportunity, this massive opportunity here. So, what do you think is your client's personal hesitation to go on Google Shopping Actions or deploy PLAs? What is the biggest thing just usually holding them back? As is with anything new, there's always something kind of drawing people back, whether or not it's a new trend. You kind of see other people roll out on that new trend, like TikTok or literally anything in life. So, with such a historically massive company, I personally wouldn't think there is too much hesitation, but are there any myths about Google Shopping that you want to debunk and just any, personal hesitations that you see with your clients?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things so it depends a lot on, where those sellers and merchants, just how big they are, right? So, at Channeladvisor, we work with some that have fairly modest budgets, and then some that are spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars a day on Google Shopping. And so, at the smaller end, I think for sellers who maybe historically have built a business on marketplaces, the typical hesitation we see is that they're not familiar. In some cases, they're not familiar with really the dynamics of how a cost per click model works, right? So the notion of paying for advertising up front is in some cases a challenge, and of course, there's a risk there. And so when you combine that with maybe not having the best website in the world or a website that really converts well, that's where some of the hesitation comes in. And so I think, some of the things that, we hear from people is like, well, it doesn't work, or, I tried it once and I spent $5,000 and I didn't get any sales. And when you dig into that, a lot of cases, it's that they really didn't have the right skills. They really didn't know what they were doing. They didn't have the measurements in place. I mean, one of the beauties of online advertising, and especially on Google and other platforms, is you can see exactly what you're getting, right? So you can see exactly what you're spending. You can start as small as you want to, and you can see what the return is, right? Because you can measure, every dollar that you're spending. So I think sometimes people, I think, get a little bit, in terms of to your specific question about myths, maybe it's like, well, it's only for bigger companies or bigger brands. I think there's certainly a lot of large advertisers there. But the same challenge that holds true selling on Amazon is, how do you stand out from the crowd? How do you carve out a niche? It's the same thing, right? It's just, you got to get in there and you got to, figure out what that strategy is.
Totally. And are there any case studies that you want to share about how, a store at Channeladvisor or a client has grown massively with Google Shopping ads or buy on Google?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's, I would encourage people to go to the Channeladvisor website, and on the website, we've got just, I'm not even sure how many, probably 100 different success stories that we've had over the years. So we've helped a lot of different merchants really take that and really grow. And so some of them started with very modest budgets, and again, have been very successful and really grown their business on Google. So and nothing really specific that comes to mind, but I would encourage people to, if they want to look deeper in that, there's a lot of them that we have on our website under success stories.
Hmm. And so, from my experience and seeing others that deliver, sometimes we're afraid to toss our hat into the ring, like you said, because we think it's going to cost us a lot. So sometimes I feel like it's very important to define the opportunity cost, the different opportunities they're letting go of if they don't do something. So, in what other ways does it cost them to watch from the sidelines, not getting in on this?
Yeah, well, I think, one way. So, I mean, again, if you're, I think multi-channel is super important, right? And again, I think diversification is super important. And so, I think one of the ways you have to think about, any online business is, what is your customer acquisition strategy? How are you finding new customers? How are you growing the business? And I think one of the things that I think if we're talking about sellers that are marketplace maybe only or very marketplace heavy, maybe 90-95% of their business is marketplace, is how are they building an ongoing relationship with their customers, right? That's challenging in a lot of different marketplaces, right? There's different restrictions on remarketing and everything else, and so I do think I think the journey to building a relationship with customers is often expensive, right? Because you've got to build awareness, you've got to have a good value product, you got to have something that customers want to come back to you and buy again, right? And so I think the things that maybe they're missing is sort of a longer term view of how do I invest in this business? How do I grow my customer base in such a way that this is an ongoing sustainable business where I don't necessarily have to pay marketing on every sale, because ultimately, it's if you're paying a marketing cost on every single sale, that gets really expensive. And so, really the nirvana you're trying to get to is where you build the business such that you can send out an email talking about a new product launch and you're going to get a lot of sales out of that, or people are just going to naturally just come to your website, right? That's kind of where you're trying to get to, but you got to build a base to get there.
Right. So you got to build as much traction as possible so that people do come to your website and visit those channels. And then on top of that, that flywheel effect starts turning and you start getting more sales.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's often, I think where we see people that struggle is they haven't really thought about what does that process look like and what's a reasonable time horizon for that to happen, right? Let's say I'm in apparel and maybe I'm in some kind of specialty apparel. Well, somebody buys from me, they may not be in the market to buy from me again for 6 months or a year, right? But again, if you're not building that customer base that's going to come back in 6 months when you have a new product line, or the next spring, right? Maybe you're in swimwear and the next spring, coming out with a new line, then you're always sort of going to be kind of treading water, right? So I think I think sometimes people have an unrealistic. You got to have an understanding of really, advertising should really, really supercharge your business plan, but you still need to have a business plan, right? You need to have a sense of how am I growing this business? How am I getting customers? What kind of products am I going to be selling 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months from now? And then how does advertising help me get there maybe faster than I could otherwise?
Mm-hmm. So let's say that you have your own website and you want your product to sell as much as possible. And you want to put ads out so that people can just buy straight on Google Shopping. So you'd like the product listing ads in Google search. And you also are thinking, okay, like what if I also put it on buy on Google? I have my own website, but I have Google Shopping actions. But on top of that, I also have these PLAs I can put out. So if I'm a seller, like which one do I want to invest in more? Do I do both, or what should my area of focus be?
So this is something we do a lot with our clients, is figuring out sort of what is the strategy between these two different platforms. Where should I let them overlap, and where do I want to focus one or the other? So generally speaking, I would say for most businesses, I would do both, right? And then within that, especially when you get into very low priced items. So the challenge with, so it depends a lot on this website and what they sell. One of the things that Google Shopping Actions and Buy on Google is really a product line where maybe I wouldn't advertise through normal PLAs, but I would through Buy on Google, is if I sell some of my products are very inexpensive, right? So let's say I sell, stick with apparel, and maybe I have price points, everything from $9 to $200. Those products that are less than $20, it's pretty hard to pay a cost per click, even if it's pretty low, and actually make a decent return on that. And so what we often do is segment a catalog, and so say, all right, for everything that's less than $25, I'm going to send that to Google, but I'm going to make that just eligible for buy on Google, right? And I'm going to let Google serve that up and sell it there, because either I have a commission rate, which is on a low priced item, it's the low commission, or as it becomes to zero, then that's even better. And whereas the rest of my stuff, then really what I'm going to say is I'm going to let Google kind of decide that. And so if Google decides that, hey, this product is more likely to convert through buy on Google, then they're going to favor that method of buying versus just a regular PLA. So like I said, generally speaking, I would do both, and then maybe restrict some of my products from advertising based on price point. And you can get further into nuances of then looking at what's working better, one or the other. But for starters, that's certainly the way I'd start.
So it sounds like a lot of testing and optimization that needs to go on. So you kind of split out your catalog, but on top of that, Google will run its algorithm and be able to net those conversions for you. And you can kind of see that spread out in a report and you can know, okay, well, these are the products that are doing better versus not.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. I mean, digital advertising is really never ending testing, right? You're always testing and trying new things. Google's done a lot in the last couple of years around automation to make this easier and to make it, really smarter. So, one of the things that we often use is from Google. There's something called Smart Shopping, and essentially, that is you put your products in, and they're going to figure out. You give it a goal, and then they're going to figure out, all right, well, where can they serve those ads, and what time of day, and to what kind of user, and on what device, and all of numerous signals.
Right.
They're going to figure that out. You're going to give it a goal, and they're going to go from there.
Okay, that makes sense. So what kind of products should I be focusing on? So you mentioned you split it out in like high, medium, low margin products. You mentioned at the conference you raise the impression share on high products and you limit on low. Let's say you want to
Sure.
try out like an entirely new product. No history of sales, you don't know the actual margins. What's your strategy there? Or do you recommend just kind of knowing all that information before launching on Google?
Well, I think you should have a sense. So let's say you had a brand new product. I mean, I think you might not. To your point, you don't know what the sales, you don't know what demand's going to be. I think you should have a good sense of what the costs are of that product, right? So hopefully that's understood. Um, and in some cases, and I think this is very true on Amazon, that one of the strategies that we often do on Amazon with our clients is when you have a new product, you really put additional advertising behind that, right, to really get that flywheel going. And the same is really true on Google, right? I mean, if you get, so you may carve out, into different campaigns some of those new products, and you may decide that because it's a new product, you want to be more aggressive with it, right? Now, it depends a lot on whether or not if you're the brand and you've invested tens of thousands of dollars in this new line and you've got loads of inventory, you're going to have a longer investment and a bigger investment in that. Versus if you're a reseller and you're selling a drop ship product and you have no investment in it really, and you're just trying to test the market, then you're not going to go as all in on advertising and without seeing a return quicker.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's dive into some best practices here. So how do you rise organically to the top of the buy in Google feed? Like what would you suggest are the things that sellers should look at?
Yeah, so I think the first and foremost thing, and on the one hand, it is kind of amazing that this is still a challenge for a lot of people, but the first and foremost thing is getting good content. So when you think about these algorithms are only as good as the data that they feed into them, right? So I think whether it's buy on Google or just regular Google Shopping doesn't matter. Making sure that you have a good product data feed. You have descriptions that are good. You have robust product titles and images and all of those things, because you'd be amazed at how many if you don't give Google a good product title, well, it's hard to expect them to understand what that product is and how to have it show up and rank well. So the first thing, it's kind of, and I think I used the example in the conference. It's very similar to SEO, right? And if you just totally simplified SEO is a function of the content on your website, and then how well you rank, which is a function of who links to you, right? And how authoritative your website is. And you can't expect to do well in SEO if you have no content on your site, right? Or if you have very, very limited content. And so the same is true with product data with Google. So the richer the information, the more up to date the information is, right? The right price and the quantities and everything else, the brand, the country of origin, all of these different things. It's really, in many respects, it's not, having good content is something that we preach at Channeladvisor on almost every channel that we work with, right? You could say almost this exact same thing for selling on Walmart or selling on Amazon or selling on eBay. Good content allows you to convert. I think the difference on Google is that good content allows you to convert, but it also allows you to get found. So when somebody does that search on Google, that they're knowing that, yes, you do sell that brand, and this sweater that you sell is that brand, and it is this color, and it is this size, for instance.
So, what type of products, just as a whole, do well on Google? Like, the generic types, branded, non-branded, just as kind of like, taking this into the big picture, what type of products, I'm just out of curiosity, do better on Google?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, we have, we have clients selling everything from shoes to vitamins to furniture and literally everything in between. So there's not necessarily certain categories that don't work. Pretty much everything, can work on Google. I'd say some of the characteristics that are difficult is if you have very generic products that are not branded at all. Those can be pretty hard because at the end of the day, again, Google Shopping is a search engine, right? It's really built on a search engine, and so if people aren't searching for those products, that can be pretty difficult, right? To get found. That's increasingly true on marketplaces like Amazon as well, because you've got to pay for search, right, and pay for placement. So I'd say that's the one area. Very low price products are tough, and then products that are very generic and the things that people aren't searching for, those can be challenging as well.
Right. And besides content and getting your listing set up for success visually with, adequate information on your listing, what are other ways that you can, you can turn on specific functions within Google Shopping, or are there any strategies that you recommend to drive up impressions and convert buyers more?
Yeah, no, definitely. So content's really just the beginning, right? And from there, there's a number of different levers that you need to pull, and you need to figure out how they're working, right? So, all of these are working on some sort of auction model when it comes to bidding, and so you really need to think about how are you bidding for each of these clicks. There's a number of programs that Google's put in place around automation. I mentioned Smart Shopping earlier. There are programs like Target ROAS, or Target Return on Ad Spend. They basically allow you to give Google a goal, and then Google figures out how often they should show your ad, who they should show it to, et cetera. But getting the economic side of it is really important, right? So you got to have good content, but then at the same time, you got to make sure that you're converting, right? And figuring out, all right, for every dollar we spend, how much do we need to get back in revenue? So looking at the data, figuring out how do you bid accordingly, right, and appropriately, and then what structures are needed to really get the most out of that. That's another big, huge portion of this. And so we think about sort of the day-to-day management of it. It's very much looking at the market, because it varies, right? So you may have a couple of weeks where you don't have a lot of competition, and so your cost per click is lower, and you do pretty well. And then maybe some new competitor comes in the market, and all of a sudden things are different now. So it's definitely not a set it and forget it, kind of program where you can just sort of throw it out there and then just walk away. You really need to be constantly looking at what's the data telling us, how did we do compared to our goal, and then where do we need to make some adjustments, right? Are there areas of our campaign where we're doing great and we can actually afford to pay more, right? And so we should be raising our goals there, raising our bids as well. And are there other areas where we just aren't making money, right? And we need to really prune those from our campaign. So it's a never-ending sort of game of looking at the data, figuring out where do you have opportunity, where do you have waste, and then adjusting accordingly.
Right. And so we went over smart shopping ad campaigns briefly, and then we also went over going over query data, which find out which ones are performing differently. And how about let's go into the query data a little bit more. What should your kind of bidding strategy be?
Yeah, so I think it's one of the things that I talked about in the conference. It's important to understand is I think one of the misperceptions, if we're talking just about Google Shopping here, is that people often think, okay, well, for this product, I want to bid on these keywords. And that's not really how it works, right? So really what you're doing is you're sending your catalog to Google, and then you're relying on Google to match you to relevant queries, right? So whatever you typed in the search box. And by and large, Google does a pretty amazing job of that, right? You just think about the computer science needed behind, when you just type in, whatever kind of query, some running shoe or dress or whatever, to go, look at the whole landscape, all the different products that are out there, and come back with relevant results, which again they do really well. But so when we think about that, there's, even though they do that really well, what we find generally is there's still opportunities in there to be more strategic. And specifically, in the same way that in text ads, you have the concept of negative keywords where it's like, I don't want to show up if this is in there. We do some similar strategies with shopping where, we'll look at the data for a given product catalog, and we might realize that, hey, when shoppers put, something in the query, they actually convert a lot better, right? So let's say, again, let's say we're selling apparel, and we might look at the query data and see that 20% of the time the consumer is putting a size or a color in her query, right? So she's searching for black sweater size 6 or something, right? And when size and color in there, maybe it converts a lot better, right? So one of the things we may do is we may say, all right, well, let's segment that out. And so if we see that, again, the consumer has told us through this signal, like, hey, I'm expressing a size and a color preference, and we know that that's going to be a better return, well, we might be willing to pay more for that, right? So instead of paying 50 cents a click, we might be willing to pay 85 cents a click. And so we can segment things out that way to really make sure, again, that the amount we're paying for every click really corresponds to the likelihood of a conversion of that click. And because ultimately that's what we're trying to predict.
Okay. And then on top of that, you also mentioned the option that you can enable to get free traffic essentially. So Google is letting you have like this row of free organic listings on top of sponsored listings. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that and tell sellers how can they pretty much get these free sales?
Yeah, so it's pretty wild. And having been around in the space for quite a while, I mean, I remember Google, way back when, had a program called Frugal, which was, you went to a site called Frugal, Frogle, and that was their shopping engine, and it was free. And merchants loved it, of course, because it was free. So the ROI was great. And so it's pretty interesting to see Google come back with, not the same thing, but sort of a variant of that, because shopping ads have been paid for many years now. So yeah, what Google announced back in April is that they are reserving a part of the real estate on the shopping tab for free listings. And so the way you find these and the way you identify these is if you go in, do a search on Google and click the shopping tab. Generally speaking, but not always, at the top, you'll see a row of sponsored ads. And then below that, you'll tend to see the organic listings, right? And so it's a pretty simple thing to enable. And again, it's free traffic. Now, what I would caution people is, I mean, this is one of those things that sometimes is reported, very broadly and a little bit misleading, right? So you'll see headlines that say, Google makes shopping free. And that's not really true, right? They made a portion of the real estate within shopping free. But just to set expectations, I mean, what we've generally seen with our clients is anywhere between 2 and 3% uplift in clicks to up as high as like 9 or 10% in clicks, which is not nothing, right? Especially if you're already advertising a lot, that is a nice little benefit. But to be clear, the whole shopping program itself, in terms of product listing ads, is not free. So it's a portion of it, because I think, again, when that story came out, it kind of gets reported a little bit in a broad way that can be a little bit misleading.
Right. So we went through the best practices, a few of them that you had in your playbook. But what are some mistakes that people can look out for that your past clients have made? Things that they've done that people who are starting out on Google can completely avoid, and things to just keep in mind.
Yeah. So I think the first one, I guess, if we're talking about advertisers who maybe are new to cost per click advertising, right? Maybe they've done sponsored products on Amazon, and maybe they haven't done that, right? So if this is the first time they're going to be advertising, so I'll take that as sort of one group of advertisers and mistakes to watch out for. One is just first and foremost, not having an understanding of how effective your website is as converting traffic. If you don't have any idea if 100 people come to your site, how many people buy? If you can't answer that question, then it's really hard to predict how much money you should spend on advertising, right? So I think getting an understanding of what are the analytics on my site, right? Does my website convert at 2.5%? Is it 4%? Is it 8%? Is it 0.2%, right? That's sort of first and foremost. And so when sometimes I'll see mistakes made in that advertisers sort of neglect, they don't even know that, right? They get excited and they're willing to invest in their business, but they don't really understand first and foremost just how good is my website at converting traffic. So that's one mistake we see made, is just not getting the analytics in place, because then that also comes to haunt you. If you don't have analytics in place, then you start advertising, but it's really hard to say how effective it is. It's like, well, my sales went up, but was it from the advertising or was it from something else I did? So I think making sure you have a good understanding of your conversion rate, the quality of your website, is kind of first and foremost. And then secondly, kind of related, would be not having tracking and not really understanding the conversion metrics that you can measure in Google or in Google Analytics or in Facebook or wherever. And so as a result, you just sort of diving in and starting to spend money, but then not really having a way and having a clear goal going into that of, all right, I need to make, if I spend X, I need to make Y. Those goals can change, but if you don't have those measurement systems in place, it's really hard to know. It's sort of like training for a race, but never measuring yourself. And like, how do you know if you're getting better, right?
So a lot of sellers, I think they could kind of come back and answer that question saying, like, I'm a seller, not really an advertiser. So what tools would you recommend to equip sellers to better understand those kind of analytics? Or, do you recommend just outsourcing that completely to others?
So I think it depends on, I think what I would say is if once you start to get into this field, you are an advertiser. And you're going to compete with advertisers. You're going to compete with people that do this all day, every day, as a full-time thing. And so you really, in terms of whether or not you should outsource it, or, I think you have to take an honest look at your organization and think about, do you have people who understand this stuff and who can do it? And if you do, that's great. Right. But if you don't, then, you have to think about how effective is this money going to be? And especially with sellers, I've worked with, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sellers over the years. And, in a lot of cases, they're wearing a lot of hats, right, in their business. They're responsible for hiring people. They're fulfilling. They're doing all kinds of stuff. And learning the nuances of digital advertising, it's very different. And so, I think for those, I would say they're probably better off getting somebody in there who knows how to do it. If you're going to go invest 10 or 20 or $50,000 over the course of a year or a month, even, you want to make sure that somebody's doing that, who understands how to do this stuff and has done it before and knows, you can just dive in and make all the same mistakes that everybody else has made in the past. But that's expensive, right? And that's where people tend to get a bad taste in their mouth. So I think it's, certainly that's something that we do at Channeladvisor. We're happy to help people sort of on that journey. There's a lot of other people that do it as well. So I think there's not a shortage of people out there that know how to do this stuff. So, again, you can do it in-house, but I think you got to make sure that, you have those resources and you have that skill on staff. And if you do, that's great.
So just diving into the future of Google Shopping, and we're just kind of looking at these trends, right? So we're seeing Wish buy PLAs, some at Walmart's. What are other companies with huge ad accounts that's also gunning for Google Shopping ads, real estate, as we're seeing more and more companies just start buying Google PLAs as a whole?
Yeah, I think that's, the larger, if you look at the Internet Retailer 1000, the top internet retailers in the US, probably all but a handful have been doing Google Shopping for years, right? because it's a very effective program. It's a very consistent ROI. But it's not without competition, right? Like anything else, it's like, if you want to go sell on Amazon, it's hard, right? Because there's a lot of other people that have the same good idea. So it's the opportunities there, and I think what we see, from larger advertisers is, and this is a lot of what we work with them on, is, the strategies have gotten increasingly sophisticated, and so there's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of good automation from Google, but then on top of that, there's a lot of strategy that goes into how do we really get sophisticated so that we can really, at the end of the day, be smarter than the other person who's selling the same products that we are. And, so we can invest more and get that customer and get that click instead of them doing it.
So a lot of companies, more than we think, are pretty much using Google PLAs and Google Shopping. So this isn't really like a relatively untapped market, but there's a ton of opportunity there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've always felt like look, if you're selling somewhere, right? If you have a product and you have a value proposition and some degree of product market fit, somebody's buying your product. There is people on Google that you can also do the same thing with, right? No question. Now, to do it really at scale and really to get bigger, then yeah, you may have a different set of competitors than you had in some of these other channels, and that takes then strategy. In some cases, that takes money. In a lot of cases, it takes both to go compete with them. But as you said, it's not really a new thing. But at the same time, it's where a lot of shoppers are. And I think at the end of the day, I think for any brand or retailer, ultimately it's about being wherever consumers are. And consumer behavior is very fickle, right? And you mentioned TikTok earlier, right? I mean, consumers are constantly changing sort of how they do things, how they shop, how they use the web. And so I think for brands and retailers, it's really important. They need to be wherever they are, right? And there's a sizable chunk of them that are on Google looking for products.
Yeah. And do you think that Google may possibly advertise or build something sort of like Amazon Basics, build their own private label brand, or do you think that is not going to happen?
I don't know, but I'd be very surprised. I'd be very surprised if, and I think Google has publicly said before, they're not in the business of, it's part of the value proposition that they've gone to market with in the past with things like Google Shopping Actions. They're not in the business of competing with their sellers. I think, Google is much more of a software and engineering driven organization. It's very difficult for me to imagine them, private labeling, sneakers or headsets or, some other kind of product. I mean, clearly they make hardware in the form of, Nest and other things, but that's kind of different than what you're asking.
Yeah. Okay, so do you have any other advice for sellers just trying to close this out? Is there anything that I haven't mentioned yet? Is there any other tips or just anything that someone should know before they start out on Google?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to sort of reiterate a couple of things. I mean, I think one would, make sure that you really have a good understanding of what the goal is, right? If your goal is, well, I just want to be on Google, well, that's not a very good goal, right? The goal should be, I want to increase my sales by 16% on my website in the next 6 months, right? Or I want to go acquire 1,000 new customers in the next month or the next whatever. So I think having a good sense of why you're there, why you're advertising, and make some of those goals specific, right? It's not a great goal to say, well, I just want to sell as much as I can. Okay, well, what does success look like, right?
Right,
And of course, those goals can change, of course, but I think the more specific they are, the better, right? Because ultimately, it's got to come back to, well, what does success look like? If I spend $10,000 this week on Google, what do I need to get out of that, right? Either short term or long time for that to be successful. So I think making sure that you've got a clear understanding of the goals is really important, and then make sure that you've got a way to measure that, right? So through whether it's analytics or other tools, but make sure you've got a way to measure that success and see how are you charting against that journey, right? In the same way that you wouldn't just hop in the car and just start driving somewhere, right? You'd have a goal, right? Okay, I want to drive to, I'm trying to go to Chicago from, DC. So like have a goal and be able to chart your progress towards that rather than just sort of diving in and then going, well, why are we even here? Why are we spending money on this?
Exactly. I think that with, any business decision, people need to be able to track analytics and track goals and KPIs and metrics for success.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think that's all the questions I have. Thank you so much for joining me.
Sure.
We dived into a ton of things today. If there's anything else you can think of that I haven't touched upon?
No, I don't think so. I think as you mentioned earlier, the free and fast is really interesting. I think that's going to be an interesting development for us to watch. What I would say is, the space continues to change all the time, right? And so there's a lot of stuff going on. It's always rapidly changing, and so certainly conferences like the ones you've put on, I mean, those are really important to stay up to date. And so, I would encourage merchants to, especially in this time of, COVID, where we're all sort of in some form of lockdown, depending where you are, educate yourself and continue to educate yourself on the market and the industry and where things are going. I think that has a lot to do with what success you'll get.
That's all for today. Remember, if you want to get started in just a few days, head on over to deliver.com/Google. Reach out on live chat and we'll help you get set up over at Deliver. This has been Multichannel Millionaire, your go-to podcast to scale your e-com business to extraordinary heights. And this has been your host, Selena Chong.